For the people listening, Joe and I are currently reading a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was the subtitle of that is Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. It was written by a guy who's an educator, among other things, writer, Neil Postman. He wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1984, or it was published in 1985, in a response to a discussion he had had about looking at George Orwell's 1984. And the overarching theme of his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is instead of thinking about an Orwellian dystopia, he's thinking more of like an Aldous Huxley Brave New World future dystopia. The main difference being control through pain or control through pleasure. Orwellian with pain and pleasure in the Brave New World. And the book, we read the first 4 chapters for today. And we are currently reading the 20th anniversary edition, which includes, so that would put it around 2005, 2006, at the dawn, early-ish in the internet, still pre-social media, which I'm sure we'll get into some of those topics as we go through a little series discussing this book. And it included a extra foreword from Neil Postman's son, which included a little extra stuff given the 20 years difference, and sort of, I don't know if this book is very well known. So, but there are some educators who are using it, and it had some inclusions from students who had read it, who either agreed or disagreed or different stuff about what they thought Neil Postman was talking about. And because most of what he's talking about is related to television, the landscape has changed so much, the media landscape, that even he nor his son in 2006 could have predicted where we are today in 2020. But that being said, the book is not irrelevant. It's more relevant today than ever. It doesn't feel dated. It doesn't feel like everything he said was wrong because he couldn't predict social media. Some of the things that he says about television and when it's done to discourse are still applicable today and maybe increasingly applicable. So that's about a little bit about the book. Again, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business by Neil Postman. I think Joe and I are going to probably go through the book, things that stuck out to us, have discussions about it, but we might go through
Yeah, I think we would
chronologically.
probably go in through chronologically. Okay, well, I think to start, I would like to read a passage from the foreword with the
Okay,
contrasting the George Orwell and Huxley
sure,
because
sure.
that really struck me.
Please.
Okay. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared that those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny fail to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. The book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right.
Thank you for sharing that.
I know you had you had read Brave New World, but you had not read 1984. Is that
I
correct?
still have not read, yeah.
Okay.
But at least with 1984, it's almost ubiquitous in its impact. So many people understand the word Orwellian
Sure.
without being aware of George Orwell or 1984 necessarily. And many people know of 1984 just because it's in the lexicon and what it
Mm-hmm.
means.
I can't say that
Because
I
people,
hear people saying Huxleyan, you know.
no, no, you don't. And part of that is one, just because 1984 had just a bigger impact. It's more well known than Brave New World. Also, scarier. And so people have been basically since 1984 came out, which I think was the 50s. Uh, people have been saying like everything's Orwellian, and it just and people have been talking about that for a long, long, long time.
Yeah. I also think it was a much more entertaining read.
Is it?
Well, I didn't personally. I was not very entertained by Brave New World, frankly. I thought I was very interested in what was going on in the novel. There's a lot of fun ideas in there.
You didn't like the characters.
Um, Not particularly. And the way this story jumps from one character to the next and to the next, I just I didn't much care for that.
And Fahrenheit 451 fits in.
Do you know when that one was released?
Uh, no, not off the top of my head. I have your copy of it, but it's all the way across my room.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Had you you'd read that before, right?
Nope, have not read
Oh,
that
you
one
never
yet.
read that, and like I think I probably read it. I don't know. What, very early middle school? Maybe even before
Really?
that. I don't know. I remember reading it at SJB. Yeah.
Wow.
Or well, we were assigned to read it. Who knows if I read the whole thing?
Spark Notes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a little sad how
Now,
little reading I did back then.
what kind of future does 451 present, if you can recall? Is it closer to Huxley or closer to Orwell?
It's
I'm
much
assuming
closer to Orwell.
that's what I was
Well, I
assuming.
mean, yeah, I mean,
If the title is reference to burning books,
yeah,
then
exactly.
yes.
It's very easy to see how that's looped in closer with Orwell. Yeah, that's it's a very short read. You could probably get through it in one sitting, honestly.
Yes, it's on the list. One of the other things is amusing ourselves to death, or the dystopia through or control through pleasure, is harder for people to grasp. So it's easy to stoke fear about something that you don't like. It's harder to stoke fear about the dangers of the things you like. So, and that's what the characters wrestle with in Brave New World to some extent, because some of them are complacent because everything is supplied to them, and then others might eventually challenge that. If you haven't read it, it's recommended, or maybe not. But um, so I think in let's say narrative fiction, dystopian futures are often much more likely to be closer to 1984 or some Orwellian dystopia than they are to being one like Brave New World. I don't know if I've seen one that's like, I suppose I maybe have, if you really get into it. I haven't seen Brazil in a little while. But if you go in, aside from the actual adaptations of those literary works, I don't know if I see Hollywood putting out something that's, a big blockbuster dystopian movie like The Hunger Games or whatever else, Maze Runner or something. I feel like those things are closer to an Orwellian dystopia than, I mean, maybe, I don't know if Ready Player One is it. I don't, that's like
Mm.
everyone just lives inside the oasis. So I don't know if that's what, we're talking about, or maybe, but those aren't the scary versions. I mean, some people look at something like that where they could literally amuse themselves to death, relinquish all control, relinquish all their rights because everything's provided. And some people, unfortunately, would be okay with that. Unfortunately, I was going to read a part of just the thing that says in 1985 to give context to people about the time this book was written, but I don't really want to read the whole thing. But just for anybody listening who wasn't alive back then or doesn't remember, I wasn't alive back then, or so doesn't remember or just isn't aware. Uh, Ronald Reagan is president at the time, which will be a through line through the book because Ronald Reagan was an actor. And one of the reasons it remains intensely relevant today is because in recent years we have elected another celebrity public figure to that office. Unlike Reagan, Trump was not a governor. Reagan was the governor of California for a while. I think he did a bad job, but that's beside the point. He at least was in the political sphere before he was the president. But the comparison of a celebrity, maybe quote unquote entertainer, being able to assume that office is, I think, very prescient. Or it's so similar that the things that Neil Postman writes about in this book are very easily applied to what happened in 2016 and what we're going through today, and likely could even easily be
Likely more so.
likely more so. And there's some stuff I want to point to later in one of the chapters. I took some screenshots, and because I'm reading on my phone, so I can't highlight stuff very well. But about discourse, especially coming from presidential candidates, and how that changed. Now, famously, Nixon lost to Kennedy in the 60s because it was like some of the first televised debates. And I can't remember if that comes up. I'm sure it does. Because he looked terrible. Now, years later, 68 or whatever, after Johnson, Nixon won by a landslide, and he still looked terrible, but there was just other things that had developed over the
I remember like
time that
critiquing parts of that debate, saying like, I think Nixon had like some spotlights on him or something, and then so he looks like a sweaty mess. And what was Kennedy? You said Kennedy is just like this really young guy, and I think yeah, people really got into the nitty gritty of it, trying to like pull strings on why he looked that way. Yeah, one had spotlights on him and the other didn't, or some I don't know.
well, and what's interesting, if you can really put the results of that election as that is the shining moment. It was the televised debate where Nixon looked terrible,
Sure,
and that's what ruined him, which I don't think you can necessarily say, but some people say that.
certainly a factor. Yeah,
And
yeah.
if that's the case, then what Postman writes about and is worried about, we should be extremely worried about and should have been worried about then, because that is a
Mm-hmm.
perfect example of the discourse around politics
Kennedy was a good-looking man.
completely absent of policy or anything. It was totally in show business and spectacle and entertainment that drove, if that was what changed the election, which that's um, a bit upsetting. And I think while different, uh, Donald Trump was able to tap into an energy that was also absent of traditional discourse, but was able to connect with people on another way, in
So,
another way.
do you think, giving the two elections you're talking about here, do you think that was because the medium itself of these of television is what was pushing discourse in this new direction, or do you think it was more about maybe not the technology itself, but the TV culture itself? Because that kind of
Um,
guides us into the first chapter of the medium is the metaphor. So do you think, given the
yes.
two examples you gave, do you think it truly was like it's like intrinsic to this medium of television, or do you think it could have been
Uh,
differently?
I'm not sure. I have to think. And before I answer, I do just want to go back to
Sure.
so Reagan's president in 1985. Top TV shows are Dallas, Dynasty, The A Team, Cheers. Just watched an episode of the Cheers recently. The Jeopardy episode is funny. There was a lot of televangelists like Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell. Some of those are still around. MTV was relatively new. Um, the Mac computer was 1 year old. USA Today is 3. People Magazine 10. Uh, African Americans are known as blacks. Martina Navratilova is the best female tennis player. Trivia Pursuit is the top selling board game, etc. So that's, don't you feel like you're in 1985 now? Just knowing all that context. Okay. So do I think it's the medium itself or the technology in both cases, or is there something else happening? Can you say your question again?
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you pretty much had it. Yeah, if you thought it was this new, I guess, direction that discourse was trending in, was, I mean, sure, certainly it's the the mediums at play here, but I'm wondering if you think it could have turned out differently if we had maybe a different culture around what television is. It wasn't just this whole entertainment industry. Like, could we have created
Yeah.
a healthier culture around it so maybe it wouldn't have ended up how it did, or is it truly just the medium itself, this new attribute of visual appeal and aesthetics?
Well, I think the answer to that is complicated, and it might go back pre television, as we'll get to in the book when they talk about the telegraph and how that changed things. Television certainly changed a lot of things. But how the public has interacted with something
Yes.
like politics, I think the issues that made television the problem started long before then. And I think that's a little bit addressed if we look at, one of the things I wanted to read is some of those excerpts from the Douglas Lincoln debates.
Oh yeah, I've actually had to
Uh,
read a couple of those excerpts for one of my classes.
yeah. And so when we get there, we'll get there. Uh, I think it would be useful, and I didn't prepare this for this time, if one of us, or we can switch off, like writes up kind of a succinct summary of like the chapters so we can
Sure.
introduce the medium as the metaphor and then sort of talk about it after we give, sort of an introduction. I
Okay.
have something that I can read that uses the title that maybe will give people an idea,
Okay.
and then you can read yours.
Sure.
Is that okay? Um, so when the author says I, it's Neil Postman. I hope this is succinct enough, but this is on page 13, where he says at the bottom, maybe three-quarters of the way down, What I mean to point out here is that the introduction into culture of a technique such as writing or a clock is not merely an extension of man's power to bind time, but a transformation of his way of thinking, and of course, of the content of his culture. And that is what I mean to say by calling a medium a metaphor. We are told in school quite correctly that a metaphor suggests what a thing is like by comparing it to something else. And by the power of its suggestion, it so fixes a conception in our minds that we cannot imagine the one thing without the other. Light is a wave, language a tree, God a wise and venerable man, the mind a dark cavern illuminated by knowledge. And if these metaphors no longer serve us, we must, in the nature of the matter, find others that will. Light is a particle, language a river, God, as Bertrand Russell proclaimed, a differential equation, the mind a garden that yearns to be cultivated. But our media metaphors are not so explicit or so vivid as these, and they are more complex. In understanding their metaphorical function, we must take into account the symbolic forms of their information, the source of their information, the quantity and speed of their information, the context in which their information is experienced. Thus, it takes some digging to get at them to grasp, for example, that a clock recreates time as an independent, mathematically precise sequence, that writing recreates the mind as a tablet on which experience is written, that the telegraph recreates news as a commodity. I'll stop there. Um, I just was thumbing through and picked that because he talks about what he's trying to mean, even if that seems impenetrable, where you're still confused on why the medium is the metaphor. We're gonna get into that and talk about. He tried to say what he meant there a little bit.
I do particularly like the intro, the beginning that you mentioned about the clock and time. How
Yes.
that kind of, maybe in a sense, we do kind of manufacture our own sense of time in a way. It's hard to have any perception of time. We didn't have these hard quantifiable numbers, minutes or seconds or
Well, I mean, we would have the astrological ways to
sure,
keep time.
sure, but it would be, that would be a completely different perception of time, I feel.
Yes,
I think you would
absolutely.
start to view the day, the length of a day would feel different. I feel like maybe a week would feel different or a month would feel different if we weren't consistently micromanaging for time, especially in this demanding civilized culture we live in now. Everything is by the minute.
Yeah. What else did you have on 4 and 5?
Okay. American business discovered, long before the rest of us, that the quality and usefulness of their goods are subordinate to the artifice of their display. That in fact, half the principles of capitalism, as praised by Adam Smith or condemned by Karl Marx, are irrelevant. Even the Japanese, who are said to make better cars than the Americans, know that economics is less a science than a performing art, as Toyota's yearly advertising budget confirms.
Hmm. Why did that stick out to you?
Just trying to embody what consumer culture really is. And if
Mm.
you take this sort of reality or concept, or what, call it what you will, and you try to tie it into, I don't know, maybe some of the sentiments that Alex or Devin would express, their libertarian ideologies of how we should hold businesses accountable and what kind of products we should consume. That's like kind of making the assumption that we know how we're interfacing with these products, how we're valuing these products, and we know,
Mhm.
I don't know, that we're just correctly perceiving them and appraising them for what they are. And
Yeah.
it requires you to be informed when in generally when the public buys stuff, they're not thinking about the function or the whatever. You're looking at the appeal and the aesthetics of
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of? Thank you for saying that and explaining why it was interesting to you, and while you were talking, one of the things that came back to me is, this idea of advertising, which he talks about later in a later chapter that we'll discuss today, even though we're already at an hour about, but I started recording early. Um, and the difference between selling a product based on what it is versus selling an idea, selling a personality trait, selling a something unquantifiable to people that is then connected intrinsically to the product. So by the nature of them wanting that trait or that idea, they think the product is the way to get there. And one of the things, this is only tangentially related because you talked about Toyota or cars or whatever. In way back when, early 20th century, cars through Ford and General Motors are starting to be produced and mass produced. And something happened with General Motors, and I can't remember his name. Was a executive of some level at General Motors. And they realized that they were building cars so well that if a person bought a car and used it, that car would last them 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or maybe longer because they were built well. Now, outside of something like planned obsolescence, which this isn't about, that guy who I can't remember his name wrote an essay about how to sell cars to people that already had cars functioning and that would last a long time. One of the ways that they did that is every year you put out a new car, or you put first they took a car of the year and they put it in like a glass box on a showroom floor, and it says $20,000 on it, and then or whatever would be appropriate at the time. And then the next year, you have the same car in the same box, you slap another sticker on it. Well, now it's 15,000. Now it's 12,000. Now it's 10,000. Now it's 7,000. Now it's 5,000. And you're just over time telling the consumer that even though their cars still work, they're somehow worth less. Now we know that they say the minute you drive a new car off the lot, its value drops immensely. And there's not a great reason for that necessarily, but I understand the reason from certain perspectives. But it points to this idea of selling people things they don't need. How do we do that? We made a product too good, so now no one wants to buy it. One of the examples that people say is like, for you, there's some people in this country who are still using their grandparents' knives and forks because you could build something that lasts a long time. When our old washer and dryer for clothes lasted maybe 20, 30 years. Well, now they might last 5, 10, or less. And part of that's planned obsolescence. And part of that is convincing people that their old products aren't good enough. You need to get the new products. And whether that extends to electronics like phones or computers, or whether it extends to, other aspects, I think it does point really to what advertising as a form of media, or as a form of, dare I say, entertainment, has changed the discourse in a way, because they figured out how to sell. And as you described, it's sort of something how it works in the human psyche. They sort of cracked the code to figure out how to make that work.
Thinking about all the different products we consume, that you can extrapolate this idea out to, like, I don't know, like, I guess the value of any item is what one person is willing to pay for it, whether it's worth that or not. So, I was thinking about, like, drinking this, like, $90 bottle of scotch, right? Is it really that, like, is it how good can a bottle of scotch really get? Steve tried it, and sure, the flavor was, I don't know. I'm not like a scotch connoisseur here, right? But there was definitely, it was, I don't have much to compare to. Like, it was very flavorful, but it was still scotch. It still was like, I had it straight, and it still had an immense burn to it. And Steve was like, I wish it didn't have that. I wish it was smoother, because I've had $30 bottle of whiskey that's like really, really smooth. So I would, maybe the flavor isn't up to snuff, but I would still prefer just a smoother beverage. So now with something like scotch, or you can say wine or something like that, people spend crazy amounts of money on this kind of stuff. And I just like to think, like, how good can the product actually get? It
Yeah.
requires, you can, sure, maybe you could say, like, maybe if I had, I don't know, if I was more in tune to my taste buds, I had a better vocabulary to pick out the subtle differences in beverages or food or whatever.
Ooh.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I think it might be helpful to think about something like that
Oh, sorry, but I
versus
was gonna just finish by saying eventually it is kind of just selling status, maybe.
sure, and I'm gonna connect to that a little bit too, but I wonder if we frame things slightly differently, and that's the only way I would push back on that is because you might go to a really expensive a Michelin star restaurant, you know, and you're paying hundreds of dollars,
Mm-hmm.
but you're viewing that one as an experience and two like is a culinary experience, a sensory experience, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
I think helpful to view that as an art form, right? And so then there's value to it outside of just whatever. And so some people who make wine or make scotch might think of it as an art form that they're using to and then they sell it. Maybe they're selling that experience and overselling it. Maybe they're selling the status. Maybe they're going further than they would, but there might be intricacies there. And I think about like, seeing a high school musical, not the Zac Efron thing, but seeing a play at high school versus seeing a Broadway thing. One, there's difference in talent and technical differences, but it's an experience. It's an art form in a way that I try to think about culinary experiences like that
Hmm.
similar. So, like, I know that I could eat food that I could survive on for really, really cheap, right? But I can also easily see why someone might spend $600 on a small little fucking thing, because it's performed by a master chef at the top of the game with really technically complicated things presented in a way
Hmm.
that's incredibly beautiful, and the flavors are and the experience of eating it is something that might not be the value is perhaps not equatable to the monetary value. Now, if it's selling status, because you can say, "Oh, I had a fucking $600 bottle of wine, and I took this girl on this date, and we had this crazy thing." I mean, that's part of it, but I think there's another part of it that's a little different than like uh like a hammer or a drill or a wheelbarrow.
I see what you're saying. I just have trouble, or at least as just an average Joe, I can more. It's easier to see and critique like a really great meal versus something like an alcoholic beverage.
Okay, sure.
It's hard to, I don't know. I feel like I could probably speak to some of the best meals I've ever had, but if I was gonna speak out to like some of the best liquor I've ever had, it would be like maybe I could settle on something, but it would be marginally better. I
Yeah,
don't know. The sensory experience doesn't parallel what food does for me. And I think
yeah,
a layman would probably agree with that. I don't know.
sure. Yeah, I'm one of the things also is in relation to wine or scotch is time. So how long is it in sherry
Mm-hmm.
oak casks, or how long is a
18 year.
bottle? Yeah. So there's that's
Do
another
you
value thing
do you
when
think people that are consuming these beverages, like, you were paralleling it to maybe an art form, and I can see why you did that, but do you think a large portion that are consuming these products would do that? No. Okay.
no. And I don't know if everybody who makes those products would do that either.
Yeah.
On
Very
some
true.
level it is, and some level it's not. I mean, I think about
Yeah,
some
but
things that 25-year-old aged cheddar. It's very expensive. Uh, One reason is because it's had to sit for 25 years. And that's, while it doesn't like cost something, I mean, it does a little bit in just its space and the over time. The time is has a value as well. So, it's yeah, that's a factor there. So maybe you're paying $90 because it's, an extra dollar for every fucking year it spends in a cellar. Um, what is your take on, or is there a way you can sort of synthesize it as the medium being a metaphor? Do you have any? Because for me, that was hard to grasp a little bit. I think the book does a good job
mhm. It gives a lot of
getting
different
into it.
examples, I think.
Yeah. But is there a way that you were able to wrap your head around that concept of this chapter?
Well, the closest thing that I had to this kind of concept already was just, this is similar but not the same, but just the paradigm that you view the world through. Like, this kind of, when I was reading this chapter, it kind of made me think about when you were labeled like the political magnet in some of your classes, because you're viewing these
Oh,
films.
a firebrand.
Firebrand, sure. But yeah, so you're taking in this content, and then your perception of it is through the lens of, well, not just politics, but just the knowledge that you have obtained. So I kind of extrapolated that out to, this is the medium is the metaphor. There's this, so maybe instead of just looking through this knowledge to create the perception of what you're taking in is, but now it's, you're using this medium that is altering the perception of what you're taking in.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way to think about it. And that points to, some of the things he talks about the clock, or he talks about the glasses and what that's done to how we experience things as humans, and what it does to change the way our minds work. And then, that might extend to public discourse, which is a big part of this book is about, and coincidentally something that I'm very interested trying to change for the better in modern times. If you will indulge me for a second, can I just read the last paragraph of the chapter?
Sure.
We don't have to move on yet if we want to still talk about it, but I think this kind of gives like a little good kind of um, statement of the thesis or the intention
Okay.
here.
I also had one, but mine's just one sentence, but you can go ahead
Go
first.
go ahead. No,
All right, I'll do
I mean
mine then.
if yours is before mine, yeah.
It was on page 10. It's
Yep, go
just
for
one
it.
sentence. So, each medium, like language itself, makes possible a unique mode of discourse by providing a new orientation for thought, for expression, for sensibility.
Yeah. What sort of things, without like going further into the book, where's something that, language might have changed how we express things, or whatever, how our worldview is. Is there other things that you can think of off the top of your head that have changed uh, our discourse? I mean, I can, one that jumps out to me is like smartphones. Do you want me to explain why I think that?
Well, I can understand on a rudimentary level why you'd say that, but if you would like to elaborate, go ahead. And I'm just
I mean, I don't really want to, but
okay.
I think the it's I think almost pretty evident how that sort of changed thing in discourse, changed how people communicate, and that's communicating via the tool, but using the medium, but also having that medium permeates to discourse and changing of discourse without using it. I mean, it changes how we
Yeah.
interact with each other.
And,
It changes
and
how
just
we
saying
talk.
smartphone itself does lump in
Ooh,
wh-
yeah, I don't like that term.
what?
Smartphone. I don't know.
What did you
Anyway,
say?
no, I did say smartphone.
But I was just gonna say that there are obviously different apps, services, what you will, that are affecting discourse in different ways. Like now we
Yeah,
have progression from Facebook, maybe from MySpace, and then we had Facebook, and now there's all these different forms. Instagram, maybe a little bit different. We have Snapchat, text messaging, phone calls aren't nearly as prominent. Email sticks around for still whatever reason, and there's also I don't know. There's just a constant evolution in the type of I don't want to say just social media, but like I can't
yeah.
say anybody saw
But,
something like TikTok coming to fruition. So
well, TikTok is just
it just makes me wonder
Vine.
what other sorts of apps that could come to fruition and change discourse even further.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, if we're talking about in relation to TV in 1985, if we're talking about discourse and sound bites, the initial time limit on Snapchat puts a limit on communication. Vine videos and TikTok or Musically are very short. Twitter has a character limit, which all feeds into this.
Twitter's been a big
Every
one,
you got
especially
it.
since Trump was using it.
You got to figure. You got everything's got to be 150 characters, or now it's 300, and then you can have a whole thread where you do more and more. But it's really distilling everything into what at the time in '85 was just talking heads saying something on the internet or something on the nightly news versus so that's certainly changed in a similar way, and maybe some might call it like the um attention deficit-ing ization of the of the public at large. Well, let me just read this and see if we have anything to say about it, and then if not, we can move on, and then
Sure.
we'll have to sort of evaluate how we are as far as runtime. So it says, when Galileo remarked that the language of nature is written in mathematics, he meant it only as a metaphor. Nature itself does not speak. Neither do our minds or our bodies, or more to the point of this book, our bodies politic. Our conversations about nature and about ourselves are conducted in whatever languages we find it possible and convenient to employ. We do not see nature or intelligence or human motivation or ideology as it is, but only as our languages are. And our languages are our media. Our media are our metaphors. Our metaphors create the content of our culture. So that's how he ends the the chapter. And if you're looking for a way to understand or be able to convey what the medium is, the metaphor means, I think you can point at linear progression. He says how we understand things. Well, we understand things in terms of our language in the way that we're able to, and then that becomes our media, and that becomes something else. And I think that's a good, way to summarize that. I think, admittedly, was a little tough to comprehend at the beginning.
I think that was well said.
Yeah, next year next week next year. Next week, we'll come back and we'll continue doing a series about this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and our thoughts on it. And if you like to read along with us, I highly recommend the book. We're not going to go through it one chapter at a time every time. Just so happens that today that's what it is. So we'll come back with media as epistemology on page 16. And that's our show for now. That is the things that we talked about. Again, I'm Adam Bunky. I'm one of the hosts. I'm on this podcast, and so is Joe. And eventually, if the podcast is something, we might have a website which we will link, and
Yeah.
we will figure it out. So thanks, and that's it.